Welcome to this module on Java Beans. In the earlier modules, we have seen about servlet and about JSP. This module is here just because we need some knowledge about Java Beans when dealing with JSP. There are going to we will be looking later on. Later modules we are going to be looking at tags which we use in JSP. So within JSP there are tags which are dealing with Java Beans. Fine. Even when we develop any web application, we will be following architecture we call as MVC architecture. We have a module to discuss about the MVC architecture also. MVC architecture for a web application. It is a good architecture so that we can maintain our applications in a better way. The idea about when we use the MVC architecture, there also it is recommended to use, we will be coming across usage of Java Bean components. Let us try to understand what is a Java Bean component. We will be looking at Java Beans in slightly more detail, but not too much of detail though. We will not go to each and every bit of it, but yes, of course, we will try to get a feel of the depth of Java Beans. Fine. Java Beans can be very simple. It is just as such, if we define Java Beans, yes, it can be a very simple thing as just being a plain Java component which has got properties. What do we mean by just it has got just properties? So, let us go into what is this Java Beans. It is not just about properties that we have in a Java Beans. Why Java Beans came? What is the history? When did they come? So, yes, for most of the programming languages, it is not just the programming language which we have. They always come with some kind of a development tools. There are IDEs for, so even for Java, we got a lot of IDEs and the various options. Fine, you got NetBeans, you got Eclipse, fine, there is this various options here. There used to be a lot of other, many of them, but okay. And similarly, we have other programming languages, like we have languages Visual Basic. We say Visual Basic, but that is basic language, and Visual Basic means there is a GUI tool for it. Basically, the idea here is there are tools and which are helpful for development, but what these tools are doing for us? These tools have their own library of components which are helpful in using. Fine. If you use NetBeans, if you use Eclipse, yes, there also we will come across, oh, I want to create some GUI application. Okay. So, develop some component. The tool will have its own library of components. Okay. If you were using any Windows application, fine, developing a Windows based application on Windows platform, oh, we used to have something called ActiveX components. What was that ActiveX component? A component which could be used on Windows platform, fine, across various application, various languages. Fine. Same way here, what is Java Beans? Java Beans is a component, a simple component technology which is used by various tools here, fine, for the Java platform. Fine. It is a Java component technology for the Java platform. Fine. But the idea here is there are a lot of things, there are a lot of protocols rather, okay, or lot of standards which have been defined for how it would be used by tool. Fine. For example, most of the cases the tool like the NetBeans IDE or any other IDE, it is not only NetBeans IDE, any other IDE, any IDE, it is not that, oh, it is only NetBeans who is going to be using the Java Beans component. Okay. Any Java based IDE could be using the Java Bean component. So, Java Beans is nothing but a component technology. Fine. In a very simple form, when used in a very simple way, the way it is used mostly with the web application, it is a simple plain component which has got a few properties. Fine. It is a component used for storage of some information, and it would have some get and set methods, or which we call as properties. So, as such, yes, Java Beans from that angle, from a web application point of view, could be a very simple thing, could be developed in a very simple manner. But it has it's when we talk of Java Beans in general, yes, Java Beans is much more than just being a set of properties, a component holding a set of some information. Okay. fine, it is more about how it is used. There are a lot of things which relate to how it is going to be used inside a tool like NetBeans or Eclipse or Idea IntelliJ, fine, there are so many of them. So, let us see what exactly is there in the JavaBeans technology. So, yes, first part, a JavaBeans, any JavaBeans, what is JavaBeans component? A JavaBeans component from development point of view, if someone is developing a JavaBeans component, it is going to be some kind of a public class, a few requirements for JavaBeans, or it must always be a public class. Okay, a public class which should be, it is recommended that it should be serializable, fine. So, that yes, these kind of components can easily be transported across anything, fine. Another few other things, this JavaBeans component would have a set of properties. A set of properties, for normally a property, if someone has to have a properties, he would have in that particular class definition, he would have some instance variables which store information. Okay. And for those instance variables, they provide get and set methods, getter setter methods, getter a very common thing, fine. Yes, these getter setter methods form properties, there is a get method, there is a set method, and therefore, I have a property of a certain kind. So, if someone wants to have properties, he would have get and set methods. Okay. So, say for example, in case of a component like if I consider GUI components which are used in AWT, we have component like a button. What does a button have? Button has a label. How? Button has a property called label. Button has property label because it has a pair of method. It has a method called get label and it has a method called set label, and therefore, label becomes a property for the button, fine. All components, most of the GUI components, all of them in fact, because we have this component class, right. So, all components are inheriting certain properties from the component class. They have this method, these components they have this property of visible. Visible is a property. What is the type? Boolean, true or false. Visible is a property for all components, fine. When I say component, I mean the class, any class which extends from the component class, okay, of Java AWT, fine. The visible is a property because we have a pair of method again, a method to fetch the value and a method to set the value. Yes, we have a method called set visible which requires a Boolean value, and we have a method called is visible. Yes, of course, here because it is a Boolean type, in this case the convention is to use is and not get, fine. Other than Boolean, the convention is to have get and set methods. Okay. So, if we have a class, if we develop a public class and if we put a number of get and set methods, fine, a pair of get set methods, fine, then the various pairs of get and set methods where the get method returns a particular type, does not require a parameter, returns a value of a particular type, and the corresponding set method takes a value of the corresponding type and return type is void. These have to be public methods again. Yes, of course, if we have such that pair of method, that creates one property for us. This is the default behavior for JavaBeans. Any JavaBeans component, it is just simple to have properties there just by introducing a pair of methods. Pair of method form a property. What is the purpose of this method? Yes, a method which can fetch the value, a method which can set the value. So, maybe I am developing a public class. Who recognizes these properties? Where are these properties going to be used? If you have used an IDE, any IDE, recollect, in an IDE, you do a drag and drop, fine. You drag and drop your component into your frame or something, fine. From the component library, you may drag it into the frame, and when you drag the component into the frame, drop it into the frame, you come across a property list. How is this property list created? How is this property list created by the tool? Okay. That is where this JavaBeans technology comes into picture. How does it create that? How does it identify that these are the properties in the so and so component? For that purpose, Yes, it uses this Java Beans standards. We have some standards. One of those things was a very simple way, as we have seen so far, is if we want to have a property, we will have a pair of method, a get and set method. Now, I am inheriting, I am having a class, I am developing a public class, I am inheriting from some other class, and from that class what I am inheriting are some of the public get and set methods. But are all of those get and set methods going to be properties for me? If I am inheriting, they will all become properties. Do I have a mechanism of controlling what should be considered as a property here by the tool? Should NetBeans consider each and every get and set pair as a property for me? Or maybe I have some other method. I have not got a method called get and set, but I have got a method called read and write, maybe read so and so and write so and so, or maybe I might have some other value. It's just a question of fetching a value and setting the value for my property. I want that some pair of method. Do we have a mechanism? So, is it just the get and set that will decide? Oh, it is a simple thing, because if you follow conventions, yes, things can be simple, but maybe do I have control over what should be the, because when I inherit methods, maybe I will not have everything which I inherit to become a property for me. Okay, I am developing component and I do not want everything, every get and set to be a property, or maybe I have got a pair of method which can give me a value, which can allow you to change the value, but that should not create a that should still be a property, though it is not following the convention. Convention is get set. So, get set is simply a convention. Okay. Yes, there is actually a proper mechanism of specifying what becomes your property and what should not become a property. So, for that, whenever we develop a component is accompanied by a bean info. So, maybe if you are creating your own class, new component class, maybe you might create a class called new button. It is a button which I am creating, but it is a new kind of a button. Maybe I do not want to use the button which is ready made for me. Okay. So, if I create a new button, how do I go about it? So, here if I create a class called new button, and this is going to be a Java Beans class, I decided to be a component, a Java Bean component. In that case, if I want full control over it, it can be then I must develop another class which will give information about the properties of the new button. So, if I am creating new button class, I must also create a class called new button bean info. So, yes, every bean class fine can have, it is not a must, always can have a bean info. The convention is clear, whatever is the name of the bean class and put a suffix of bean info, that should be the class which is going to be used as a class for the bean info. Of course, this bean info is not just simply any class, it is a class which must implement a interface called bean info. We have this interface called bean info in the java.beans package. Okay. So, what is the purpose of this bean info? The purpose of bean info is this: it is something which if it finds, if a tool finds that there is a bean info, then it is going to use the methods on the bean info, it is going to use the bean info, invoke the methods on bean info to fetch information about the beans. So, one very simple thing, when we have, whenever we have a component and we add the component to the component library, tools component library, okay, will be shown a palette of all the components, right. So, on the palette there will be always some kind of an icon to represent your component. Oh, what should be the icon for that component? Oh, again that information, how does it get it? How can you specify that? Oh, that again comes from the bean info. Yes, if you have a bean info, oh, that can be, you have control over what should be the icon for your bean component. So, we have this class, we have this interface called bean info, and it has a number of methods there, and if you want to take the help, we have some default implementation for all the methods there in a class called simple bean info. So, whenever we develop a bean info, we normally use the simple bean info class as the base class and extend from there and write our own things. Okay. So, coming back to those list of properties. Oh, can I control the list of properties? Of course. We have the method. What we need to do is, for our bean, we will also have a accompanying bean info class, and the implementation of bean info should override the method called get property descriptors. Yes, there is a property descriptor class called property descriptor. So, we have property descriptor to return, get property descriptor method in the bean info to be returning array of property descriptor. Fine. So, this property descriptor would have in the property descriptor we have the name of the property, what we want as the name of the property, what is the method to get the property, what is the method to set the value of the property, which is the getter method, which is the setter method, all such things can then be specified. So, we have this property bean info. So, it is not necessary that yes, we will have the get and set convention to be followed always whenever we want to have some kind of a property for our component. Of course, if there is a get set method, should it become a component? No, it is this method called get property descriptors returning an array of property descriptor, one per property. So, the number of elements in this array returned by this is the number of properties which will be recognized by the tool. So, this is defining how the tool should recognize your component, fine, how the tool deals with your component. So, we have this method called get property descriptor. Just like we have component has a set of properties, a component also has a set of methods which will be exposed. A component would have a set of events. So, we have similarly, just like we had method called get property descriptor to return array of property descriptor in the bean info, we also have get method descriptor to return what are the methods which should be recognized by the tool. Not all methods may have to be recognized. Same way, oh, what are going to be the events which are to be recognized by the tool. So, get event set descriptors, we have event set descriptors. So, there are these classes called property descriptor, method descriptor, event set descriptor in the java.beans package, fine. And these are some things which have to be returned from the implementation of bean info. So, you might be extending from the simple bean info and overriding these kind of methods. And of course, I was also mentioning about the icon, what you want as the icon. So, even for that also we have a method called get icon on our bean info interface. So, yes, it should return image. So, whatever image is returned by this, that becomes the icon for our simple bean, fine. Yes, this get icon method requires a parameter of, there are those 4 values for this parameter. The parameter value can be to indicate that yes, the tool is going to require the icon to be monotype 16 by 16 or monotype 32 by 32, or it has to be a color 16 by 16 or a color 32 by 32. So, there are those 4 options. So, maybe you may create 4 different icons like that, make them available and have the implementation of get icon method to return appropriate icon, which can then be used by the tools, fine. So, that is one thing you can do if you are developing a Java Bean component, you can have the icon also, fine, and whatever icon you like, and that can be shown in the palette. Fine. So, one thing is, yes, we got properties. Like properties, even event sets are there, fine. You can have events, you can define what kind of events. So, maybe if you have new event to be added, fine. So, if you have any new events to be added, for any event set, we will have a pair of method. If there is an event, there would always be, you would have always developed not only the event, but for corresponding to the event, there should be the listeners, right. And therefore, we would have listener and event, 2 things which the developer would have created, and as far as the component is concerned, the Java Bean component is concerned, the Java Bean component must have add listener and the remove listener. That is the kind of pair of method that our Bean component must provide. Let us not go much into that methods and the event part. Let us concentrate more on the properties part. In Java Beans, we got various kinds of properties. What we have seen earlier through, maybe we follow the get set method, is a getter and setter method is, yes, there is a get method returning a particular data type, no parameters, and there is a set method which takes a parameter of the same type as the get method's return type and return type void for the setter method. Fine. If there is a pair of method like this, that becomes a property. This is a simple property. We have other kinds of properties. We have category types of properties here. Another type of property is this indexed property. A index property is the one where the return type in the getter method is an array. The getter method without parameter returns an array, and the setter method would definitely then be taking a array. But it is not only these two methods. If it is an index property, it would again add another pair of method, another get and set method, okay, with the same name, but this time with parameter. Okay. The get method would have a parameter for the index position, so that individually on an index position within the array also you could fetch the value from the index position within an array. So, providing getter method for index value within an array and a setter method to set up the value at any particular index position within the array. Fine. So, it is 4 methods, it is not just 2 methods, there will be 4 methods if it is a indexed property. So, index properties can be are properties which are of array type, fine, and where there is a provision for accessing individual index positions within the array also, then the property is said to be a index property. Another kind of thing which may be useful in many places is we have properties which are said to be bound properties. Bound properties means what? Oh, a property, it is a property like a simple property, but in this case there is a provision in the component where someone could register, fine, some developer when he uses that component can register a listener to listen for changes in the value of a property. Whenever the property value changes, or I have a listener which can be intimated there is a value which has changed, fine. So, some code which can get executed each time change in this particular property is taking place. So, a provision is made in the component itself. So, the component in this case is not just having a get and set method alone. Oh, it has a method called another pair of method which would be needed here is add property change listener, remove property change listener, where you would have as parameter, fine, you would have as parameter a property change listener, registering a listener to listen for bound properties. So, component has provision for registering listeners for bound properties. So, a developer can then, when he is using this component, he is not only using this component, he is also able to have listeners which can listen to change in the property of the component. Yes, of course, only the bound properties of the component. In such a case, even those bound properties, there are a few things which have to be done within the getter, within the setter method of the bound property. The setter method of the bound property, what should it do? Because that is the setter method which is going to be invoked whenever the value changes. So, if a value change is done through a setter method, so in the setter method there is a parameter which is received. Yes, when he receives a parameter, what does he do? Oh, on receiving the parameter, fine, in the method the code would be to set the value somewhere, wherever he is storing the value, he will have an instance variable to store the value. Oh, it is not about just changing that, you have updated a value, but now also see to it that if we have someone who is registered for listening to this property, change in this property, he is intimated about it, and for that there are certain components, there are certain other useful classes which are available to us. We have property change support class, which can be used by our property, by our component, because what is now the responsibility of this component? The component responsibility is to be intimating. One is allowing, one thing he has made a provision is allowing someone to register for changes, to listen for the changes in the bound properties. It is not only this, he is now having the responsibility to, whenever the property changes, to intimate, whenever the bound property value changes, he has to let all the listeners know about the change which has taken place. How does he delegate this change? How does let the listeners know the change about it, invoking the method on the listener? How does he do that? So, to help you to manage the listeners, the property change listeners, and to be able to intimate about the property change to the registered listeners, we have this class called property change support, which can then be used here. The property change support class is the property change support class used here has all kinds of methods. It has also got the method called add listener, remove listener, fine, with property names, fine. So, what you need to do is just use this class in your component class, whichever is your Java Bean component having bound properties, you can have one instance variable for property change support. Whenever someone says add property change listener on your component, you simply put it, invoke the same method, just pass it on to the property change support object which you are having, fine. And then if you have done such a thing, whenever a property value changes, you simply have to invoke a method on the property change support object that yes, so and so value has changed. It is then the responsibility of the property change support. The property change support object will then take care of intimating all the listeners about the change in the property value. So, that way we have this class called property change support, simplifying the management of the property change listeners for a bound property and helping us to inform all the property change, the registered property change listeners whenever a property value changes. For that, yes, of course, what we have to do in our setter method is to invoke the method on the property change support to intimate that yes, there is this value which has changed. So, we have this method called property value changed, which has to be invoked on the property change support, and we need to specify what was the old value, what is the new value, and what is the property name. So, if we do that, yes, the property change support object can take care of intimating the listeners. So, that is one thing. So, that is one kind of property, fine. So, we have seen simple property, we have seen index property, a property with the array. Now, we have seen is the bound property. The next another kind of property which we have here is the property called is the constraint property. A constraint property, in case of a constraint property, what we have here is the constraint property is nothing but yes, it is again a property for which we allow listeners to be registered who can veto a property change. Oh, what do we mean by vetoing a property change? What we mean here is if someone tries to change the value of a property, can it be changed to any value? Okay. Oh, I would like to control, fine. Or if he is trying to change a value to something, okay, it should be controlled here. So, maybe the developer creates a component which we call as a vetoable change listener. A vetoable change listener can be registered with such kind of Java Bean component which have got what we call as constraint property. So, if there is a constraint, if Java Bean component has got constraint property, it will be using a component similar to the property change support component. There is a vetoable change support component which can then be used here also. So, and the setter method in such a case is not going to change the value first. No, it is not going to change value first. What it has to do first is before it tries to change the value, it has to invoke the method on the vetoable change support, letting it know that this is the change which is being proposed. If it is okay, if it does not throw an exception, if that invocation does not throw an, if none of the listeners, vetoable change listener is throwing an exception, then it is okay to proceed with the change, and then you make the change and then intimate the bound property listeners, those property change listeners, that there is a change which has taken place. So, fine. So, if there is a property which is both constrained as well as bound, so it would have provision for, we have methods like add property change listener and remove property change listener. Similarly, for a constraint property we will have add vetoable change listener, remove vetoable change listeners, fine, and we will have, as far as the person and the developer, when he writes a vetoable change listeners, what he does there is he has his logic to check whether there is this change is to be allowed or not. The method in the vetoable change listener is vetoable change, where he gets a vetoable change, a property change event object. When the same object is also available in the property change listeners property change event. So, property change listener also has a method called property change. There parameter is property change event. Same parameter also found in the vetoable change method of vetoable change listener. Fine. Here the property change event object has nothing but it has the old value, the new value and the name of the property. So, the idea here is that the vetoable change listener examines the old value, the new value, mainly the new value he will be concerned with, and can then decide whether it is to be changes to be allowed or not. if the vetoable change listener feels the change is not to be allowed, it is simply going to throw a veto property veto exception. So, there is a exception class called property veto exception, which the vetoable change listeners vetoable change method normally throws. Fine. So, that is a way vetoable change listener would work. The vetoable change listener vetoable change method does not do anything else, just returns from there. Fine. So, that is how we have the kinds of these 4 kinds of properties. We have simple property, we have an index property, we have the bound property, and we have the constraint properties. Fine. There are many things similar to this in the as far as Java Beans is concerned. Fine. So, it is a whole big thing as far as Java Beans is concerned. Just to introduce, yes, the Java Beans is not just about some getter and setter methods, there are a lot to it. Fine. So, you have the freedom to explore lot of things which are available in the Java Beans technology, and it is mainly concerned with how the tools are actually using the component. There is a lot of interaction between the tools and the component. So, that is something which is about the Java Beans technology. Fine. As far as our web applications are concerned, in web applications we will be following something which we call as the MVC architecture. Fine. It is a very commonly used architecture, and in that architecture the Java Bean component is used only as a carrier of some kind of data. So, we normally have some get set methods to get the data which is stored in a Java Bean component. Fine. It is just for the storage and making passing a data from one place to another place. So, it is a plain Java component having getter setter methods as far as web applications are concerned. So, that is what we have. In the next module, we will be looking at the MVC architecture. Thank you.